Hello and welcome. In this lecture, I want to walk you through the implementation of creating a database. I'm going to apply the concepts that we've learned in the previous lectures, mainly creating a database SQLite Open Helper class, a database helper. We're also going to use simple cursor adapters, and we're going to use loaders. This is going to be a simple application that will allow you to perform CRUD operations on a table. So let's get started. Let's bring up Android Studio. We're going to create a new project. It's going to be called Database Example, and we're going to start off by creating some UML screens or XML screens. So let's close this project. Let's start a new project called Database Example. And we're going to keep everything as default. We don't need to include any C++ or Kotlin support. We're going to say next. We're going to keep the minimum SDK where it's at. And we're going to create an empty activity. I have written some of the code for the graphical user interfaces. I'm going to show you how they work. I'm not going to go through those step by step since this is a database example. So let's start off with the activity main screen. Right now, this is just an empty screen that has only the hello world in it. So we're going to remove this text view, and we're going to create this screen to just have a frame layout that's a root, because we're going to replace it with our list view. So if we looked at list, this is going to be this is a concept where you can use a frame layout, and then we can just, at runtime, we can load the data. So this is going to be pretty simple. I'm going to change this to project and go to my XML files. And what I want to do here is I want to create the content for another layout. So again, the reason we're doing this is so that it's more dynamic. So I'm going to create a new layout, and I'm just going to name this Activity View Record. It's going to say OK, keep it as default. And what's going to be in here is my items for my list view. So my list view is going to just contain three text fields. I'm going to display the ID, an employee name, and an employee address. And this is going to be in a relative layout. Now I need the list view to hold this. So this is where I'm going to create my fragment. So we haven't talked about fragments in detail, but this was why we created an activity main with a frame layout. You'll do this a lot when you have fragments, and then you'll dynamically load the fragment inside the frame layout. You do this when you want to create a screen that runs on both a tablet and a phone. Depending on if you're a tablet or a phone, you would load in the appropriate fragment. A fragment is just a part of a user interface, so it can be many parts. In this case, our fragment is going to be our list view. And at runtime, we're going to load the list view into the frame layout. So here I'm going to create another layout, and this is going to be my fragment. And so this is going to be called Fragment Employee List or Emp List. And I'll keep it as the default. And what this is going to contain is my list view, also in a relative layout. I tend to use relative layouts and constraint layouts. So here's my relative layout. This is the list view. It contains a text view that gets loaded if the list is empty. Otherwise, it loads the list view. This will get replaced in my frame layout at runtime. The list view is going to contain my activity view record.xml. So hopefully that all made sense. Again, activity main is a container. It's a frame layout. At runtime, we load in the employee list fragment, whether it's empty or list view, depending on whether or not we have records. And then inside the list view is going to be the activity view record. And so we have to create some string resources at this point. So now I'm going to go to strings, and I'm going to put in some resources here. It looks like I misspelled the app name, so let's replace that. I also want to show you something else. Whenever you misspell something, you can rename it by going to refactor and rename. So I'm going to rename this to example. And it will change all of the occurrences. I also added some other strings in here for what we're going to use for updating and deleting our records. So if we go back to our layout file, we have our activity main. It's an empty container. We have our view record, which is our items for our list view, a couple text fields, text views, and our fragment, which is our list view. And it's in a frame. The last thing I want to add is I want to add a menu option at the top to add a new record. So I'm going to need to add a new menu folder in my menu.xml. So I'm going to say new Android resource directory. Or better yet, I can say new Android resource file, which will create the directory for me. I'm going to say menu.xml. I'm going to put it in a menu directory, and I'm going to leave it blank. So that will create both the menu folder and the menu directory for me. And all I want to do is add something to the menu. And this is just going to be the ability to click a button to add a record. So I'm going to have an ID for an add record, and it's going to be a little title, and it's just going to be an option on there. We've done this before. So now that we have our layout files created, our graphic user interface, I think the first thing we need to do is to create our database helper class. So here we're going to go into our Java folder. We're going to say new. We're going to say new Java class. We're going to call this database helper. And it's going to extend the SQLite Open Helper class. Right there, SQLite Open Helper. So now we're going to start implementing this class to retrieve some records from a database. It will create a database as well. So the first thing we have to do is we have to define our constants that represent the table name and the columns in our database. So at the very top of the file, we're going to create some static final variables. Table name is going to be employees, and then we're going to have 3 columns in the database: ID, name, and address, ID, name, and address. And what I'm doing here with the SQLite Open is I'm implementing all the database functionality. We're going to use this class to perform database operations. Sometimes you'll see a design where the SQLite Open Helper subclass will only create the tables and open the database, and then there will be something like a database manager, which will do other operations like the CRUD operations. I'm putting both the CRUD operations, create, read, update, and delete, and the creation of the table and the open of the database all in SQLite Open Helper. I find this is the best approach. There's no need to create a database manager class. I just have a database helper. Now that we have the columns, we have to provide the database name and the database version. These are also going to be static final variables. And the reason they're static and final is they don't change, and static is a class instance. So it's not, you can access this data outside of the class without creating an instance of the database helper. So we have a database name here, myemployees.db, and a database version name for 1. We're also going to need to create an instance of our SQLite database. The SQLite database is the instance that you use to perform the read, write, update operations. We can use this instance to create a readable database, and then we can use it to call operations like insert and query. So we need one of these instances as well. And the 2 most important methods in the SQLite Open Helper class, the 2 methods that you have to implement are the onCreate and the onUpgrade. So that's the first thing we're going to do, is we're going to implement those 2 methods. In our onCreate, all we do is we create the table, right? That's what the onCreate does. It creates your table for you. You don't have to create a database because that automatically happens when you create an instance of the database helper. Before we create the table, though, we want to define the table statement. So we're going to create another static final variable, which is going to represent the create table statement. And we're only going to create one table for this database. We're going to create a single employees table. So here's another static final variable called create table. It's creating the table employees, and then it's just creating an entire string to mimic the create table SQL statement. So it's creating a employees table name with an ID. The ID is going to be an integer. It's going to be the primary key. It's going to auto increment. We're then creating a name column. It's going to be text, not null. When you create columns, you have to provide the data types and then any other properties. And then lastly, we're going to create an address with char of 50. It's going to be 50 characters max And that's it. So this is our create table statement in SQL. We're going to now also, before we implement the onCreate, we want to just implement the constructor. The constructor for the database helper is pretty simple. The constructor will just initialize member variables. So here, our database helper, this is what creates the database. You say super context, DB name, DB version. This will create the database. So when you create an instance of database helper, you'll see this database in your internal storage. Now let's implement the onCreate. And again, all the onCreate does is it will implement the creation of the table. All your tables should be created here. And right now I only have one table on line 30, and I'm only on 39, I'm only creating one table, but you can create multiple tables. And you often will, because a database has more than one table. So on line 39, I'm creating one table, but I could have created 5 tables after that, and I would just call 5 exec SQL statements. We also have to implement the onUpgrade. The onUpgrade is pretty simple. The onUpgrade is just going to upgrade the database. And when you upgrade a database, you want to drop the existing table and then recreate it. So what I'm doing here is I'm executing something on the database, which is passed in, the SQLite database is passed in, and I'm saying drop the table. Because when you upgrade a database, you usually change the schema, change the definitions of the tables. And then I'm calling the onCreate method to recreate the table, right? So the same with the onCreate, we're passing the SQLite database and we're executing SQL code. What I'd also like to implement for this class, since I want to implement the query. I just want to see if I can read some records in the database. And I want to create the database. Remember, you always want to work in steps and then test each step. I don't want to do too much here, and I probably should test right now the creation of the table. But what I want to do first is I want to do an open and I want to do a close. So I'm going to add 2 methods for opening the database. And the open database is just going to get the writable database, because remember, we have to do that. And the close is just going to close the database. So here we can say open, we can throw a SQL exception, and we can say this.getWritable_database. Remember, you have to call the getWritable_database before you perform any operations on the database. And we're going to set that equal to our member variable database. The other method, close here, we're just going to call the instance, the close method on the database instance. Remember, database we have as a member variable right there. And so database is going to be initialized when we say open. So in any client that's using this class, before they do any CRUD operations, create, read, update, or delete, they'll have to call open. And then when they're done, they should call close. At this point, I think we're good to go. I don't want to implement too much here. We still need to implement query, read, update, and delete, but we want to test first. So let's stop the creation of the database right now, and let's try to start using it. So let's implement our main activity. And I think, after reviewing this, I don't think I'm going to utilize this activity main.xml. You would usually use this container for a tablet and phone implementation, so you could dynamically change the fragments. Instead, I'm just going to load the fragment for a phone. So I'm going to delete activity main.xml, and I'm just going to use the fragment. So let me delete this, and we'll do a safe delete, so it's going to delete anything that's using it. And then in our main activity, we'll just load the fragment employee list as opposed to activity main, because that's the one we really care about. Initially, I was going to dynamically load the fragment, but since we haven't talked about fragments yet, let's not confuse the matter. So in this class, we need to create a member variable for our database helper. So I'm going to go ahead and add that as a member variable. It's just an instance of the database helper. We need this to call our onCreate when we create an instance of this. So the first thing we need to do is create an instance of this and then call the open method on it, because we want to make sure it's writable. So inside our onCreate, we're going to initialize our instance, set it to our member variable, and then call open on lines 15 and 16. And this would be a good place to test. So let's compile this, and then we'll run it. And what we want to do is we want to test to see if our database was created properly. So let's run this on the emulator. And what we'll notice when it comes up, you see that it comes up with no records found. So it loaded our graphical user interface correctly, loaded our fragment, and nothing else. But it should have created the database. So we want to verify that database was created. We can go to our Android device monitor, and we can do that by going to Tools, Android device monitor. And we want to make sure that we started ADB up as root. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to view the files. But we can go to our internal storage and we can review the database directory to see if our database exists. So if we go to data, and then com.android.example.database, we should see that our database folder, which we do, and we see our myemployees.db. So we're good to go. Our database was created successfully. So that's a good first step. Our next step is going to be to add new records so that we can view them. Before I was thinking we would query the records first, but we can't really do any querying unless we have records in the database. And right now the database is empty. Let's add a new activity that will ask the user to add a new record. So we're going to go to File, New, and we're going to say New Activity, and we're going to say an empty activity, and we're going to name it Add Activity, Add Employee Activity. And for this activity, it's going to be a pretty simple XML. It's going to just have a couple buttons and text fields. It's going to be inside of a constraint layout still. It's just going to have some text fields. So let's take a look at this. It's just a simple layout, a name and address that you can enter, and then an add record button. So let's add the add button pressed to the class. I could say create add button pressed, and that will add that. Now let's start implementing the add employee activity. Actually, before we add the add employee activity, let's make sure that our main activity has the menu option so that it can click and add this class. So let's go to main activity and add our menu stuff. We remember how we can add menus. You just have to implement the onCreate options menu and the onItems selected. So onCreate options will add our menu. We just have to load the right XML. We're going to load the menu. And then our onItems selections will look for the add record and call the add employee activity class. So now that we've added the ability to invoke our class, we need to update the database helper so that we can add records to our database. So if we go back to our database helper, we can add a new method to insert our record. We're going to create a new method called public void add. It's going to take in a name and an address. And this needs to create the content values object, because that's how you put stuff into the database, is you populate the content values. And we're just going to create a new instance of this, and then we're going to populate it. We're going to populate it with our name and our employee that's passed in. So we just need to say content values dot put, and we want to put into the correct column, which is the name column, the value that was passed in. If you remember from before, we have static final variables for our name or columns. And then we also want to put something in our address. So now we have our content values populated. Now we can just call the insert method. So we can say database. Remember, database is our SQLite open database that we initialized in our onCreate. We can say insert, and then we can just start filling in the main values. We have to pass in the table name. This is a static variable. We have to pass in our content values, and then we want to pass in, or no, for the insert, we just have to pass in the table name, and then a null for the flags, and then the content values is the last parameter. And that's it for our insert. So now we can go back to our add employee activity, and we can implement this class so that we have a database and we can insert the data. We're going to need to create some member variables, mainly our edit text so we can read the data in our database instance, our database helper. We're going to instantiate these in our onCreate method. We first have to find the resources for our edit text. So we're going to call find view by ID, and then we're just going to create an instance of our database helper, which will open up and also open up the database. So we can say my helper's new database and open it up. And then all we need to do in our add button pressed is we need to create a couple local variables to get the text, and then call the add method on our myHelper, passing in those variables. So we can say myHelper.add, we could say name and address. And at that point, we should have data inserted into the database. The last thing we want to do is we want to go back to our main activity. So we're going to create a new intent and just call start activity. We could call finish here, but I want to invoke the onCreate method in the main activity. And we're going to go back to our main activity. We could just, like I said, we could call finish here, but then we won't call the onCreate in the main activity. I want to initialize in the main activity the querying. So back to our main activity, what we want to do here is we want to create some new member variables that represent our list view and our simple cursor adapter, because we want to populate this in a simple cursor adapter. We do that for databases. So we have a new simple cursor adapter, and we have to make sure we select the right import. We're going to do the support class. And we also have to specify the from and the to fields that we populate in our list view, or our adapter, I should say. And this is how we do our mapping. So we can use the simple cursor adapter to load a cursor object. We know a cursor object is a result set. But in order to use the cursor adapter, we have to say what are the column names that we're getting from the database, and what are the resources that we want to populate those column names in. So here we have a from string array that creates that maps the columns, identifies the database columns, and then we have a to int array which maps the text the text views of our resources. Now inside of our onCreate, we can just get our list view and we can set it to some initial value until we populate it. So we can get our list view from a resource, set it to some initial value, and then now what we want to do is we want to call database helper method to get all of our records. So we have to go back to our database helper and add another method to get all of our employees. So we can say public void get all employees, and we don't need to pass any data for this because we're reading all the records for employees in there. And what this is going to do is it's just going to create, we have to specify a query based on the tables the columns that we want from the table. So we need to create a projection string array. This will be the columns that we want to retrieve from our table. We then just need to create a cursor and call the query method on that object. So here we can say cursor database.query. Database is our instance that gets initialized in our onCreate. We say query, we specify the table name, specify the columns we want with the projection string array, and then we don't have any where arguments, so we can keep selection and selection args empty. And the other parameters, we can also have null. We don't need to order anything. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to return that cursor. Save that, and now in our main activity, we can populate our simple cursor adapter. So here we can set our adapter equal to a new cursor adapter, simple cursor adapter, and we can pass in the activity, and then we want to pass in our layout for our text views, and that's inside that's in our activity view record. And then we have to pass in our we have to pass in the next parameter is null, or we have to pass in our cursor. So let's call the query first. So we can say cursor C equals myHelper.getAllEmployees, and that's good. And now we can pass in our cursor for our third argument. And then the next two arguments are the from to map the database columns, the to, and then just a 0 for our flags. And then the last thing we have to do is we have to set the adapter. So we can say listview.setAdapter, passing in our adapter. And at this point, we should be able to insert a new record and then see it listed in our main activity. So let's build this and run it. And we have a return value, or an error here. We didn't specify we're returning a cursor. Now we build it and run it. And what you're going to see in our emulator is we're going to see our main screen come up with an empty data because it doesn't have any text, any records. We now have our plus button in our menu, so we can select that. That will bring up our new activity, our add activity, and we can fill in text fields and add some data. So I'm just going to put some dummy data in here. I'm going to say add record. This will take us back to the main screen and populate our simple cursor adapter. So we read in our database. We're displaying the ID, the name, and the address. And if we add another one, we'll see it work similarly. So we'll just say Joe Schmo. And we add the record, and we see another one listed. So that's pretty cool. We were able to insert new records into our database using the database helper, and we were able to query all the records in the database using the database helper, and then using a simple cursor adapter. The lecture is running a bit long, so I'd like to end it here and pick up the rest of this application in another lecture. What I'd like to finish is the updating and the deleting of a record, and I'd also like to use a loader object as opposed to doing my query in my onCreate. The loader object will help with efficiency. So we'll continue this lecture in the next one. Thank you.